Hey everybody, you know what I didn't do this week? I didn't go to GDC. But I did listen to a bunch of people that were live tweeting it, and apparently GDC this year is all design by the numbers. That's bad. That's a sign that the games industry is about to have a little bit of a collapse, because whenever you're focused too much on trying to make the numbers work out rather than creating content, it's generally a sign that you can't create content that you're confident in. This has become a fetish in the games industry, and every time I see this become a fetish in an industry, it usually leads to an industry collapse. So this is going to be a fun couple of years, but let's talk about some of the things that Design by the Numbers covers. One would be something like optimization. For example, when Zynga gives their speech about how the most important thing this year for them was optimizing their ad rollout so they could make 1% more. Great. I don't think there are very many indie devs that have to be told optimization is a fetish. As long as your game runs, whether it runs 1% better or 1% worse is probably not going to change anything about whether it succeeds. There are so many low-hanging fruits that you should aim for, regardless of what we're talking about, whether it's coding or marketing or UI or outreach. There's so many low-hanging pieces of fruit that trying to optimize is much less important than just doing it. And I think most people agree there, so I'm not going to go into detail. Another one might be the way of balanced design. So the idea that if you can just build the most perfectly balanced game, it'll be super popular. This is something that comes along when genres are dying, and the newest entry into the genre just really wants to make a splash, and so they figure that they'll make the best possible game. But balance is a fiction. It's only important because the player needs to be able to choose things. The player needs to be able to have options, and if it's completely unbalanced, the player won't. But even in super, super high-balanced games like Street Fighter, what happens? Well, the tournament says these characters are banned, these characters are god tier, and everybody else is scrubs. The actual level of balance is not critical. You can always patch it later if need be. No game has ever been successful just due to being balanced, and that has always been the case. So, again, I don't think there are very many people that need to be convinced of this. Optimization and balance are two design-by-the-numbers things that I don't think are very popular outside of GDC, but boy, they sure are popular inside of GDC. The third thing we want to talk about is research, where we want to design by researching. Now, is this unpopular? Well, let's talk about what it actually is. What this is making your game different based on the sorts of numbers that you find by looking into things. For example, you want your game to actually be playable. So you have someone play it, and if they don't like it, you figure out why they don't like it. You want to find bugs. That's research. You want to do outreach, see what's popular in the market so that you can hit that properly. That's research. Obviously, there isn't such a thing as you shouldn't do no research, because that means you'll just put out a buggy game and no one will play it. I know it. I do that quite frequently. So research isn't bad, but it can become a fetish, and it usually becomes a fetish when a bunch of old guys demand an explanation as to why you're doing what you're doing. A good example of this would be Detroit Become Human. I made a video about this game and its many shortcomings, but in brief, Detroit Become Human is the best game ever made, according to most awards ceremonies. They rated it like best RPG and best visual effects and best score and best audio and best everything else. And they lavished love upon it. To everybody that wasn't giving out awards, it was kind of not very good. It had holes. Big holes. Seriously weird holes. Like, how did they not think of this really, really obvious problem with their game holes? I'm not going to go into that here. If you want to talk about that, head on over to my Detroit video. But in short, the reason that they had these huge holes was because this was a research-based game. According to the live tweets of what I was seeing, what they did is they would make parts of their game, and then they'd have the testers test it. And what they would do is they'd do things like monitor the testers' eyes and see where they were looking and their heart rate and see how they were feeling. And they'd tweak their game to make those testers feel whatever the testers should be feeling. And yeah, that's junk. That's junk science. That's not how humans work. I'm sure they had a lot of fun with that. But do you want to know the real secret behind Detroit's success? $40 million. That's how much it cost to make Detroit Become Human. So if you're wondering why it was so popular, it's because it had $40 million of polish. Detroit Become Human's skin shader had more to do with its success than this junk science research that they insultingly put into GDC. But we're not getting very many, deep technical looks at how they spent their $10 million on people and $10 million on background music and whatever else. We're getting this one-off thing that the dev thought was cute because he's rich and has too much time on his hands, and so he did something that helped nobody, and certainly didn't help sell the game, but he thought it was neat. So that's what we call a research fetish, and don't do that. By all means, make sure that your game runs, make sure that people like it, tweak it so that people like it more, but don't start to fall into this crack where you've decided that numbers are going to determine how your game should work, except that the numbers are just whatever random numbers you've decided to look for and have no correlation to anything that actually exists in reality. Now, obviously, I love insulting Detroit Become Human, but that's not the only game that does this. You'll find this is becoming more and more common as we start to see a consolidation within the game industry. Things like an over-reliance on heat maps and stuff like that. You can start to see people are really focused on trying to over-interpret what players are doing. And that's something that I've talked about in the past. You can't really trust it when a player says, I like it because of this, or I hate it because of this. But equally, you can't really trust it when you randomly try and look at what they're doing and say that that must mean they feel X. Those are both not great. So just keep that in mind, and I'm sure you'll do fine. So the big one, the fourth of four. What is it? Well, it is a hopelessly large concept called Procgen. Procgen is something that's almost impossible to talk about in concrete because it's kind of a non-existent term, or rather it's a term that doesn't have a meaning that makes sense, because we've been procedurally generating content since before we were humans. Like, wolf cubs proc-gen content by playing with each other according to rules that they've worked out. This is not something that is new, but it is something that's recently become a fetish. And we've got it into this fetish state where specific things count as proc-gen and specific things don't. And you know what? No game ever created owes its success to its proc-gen algorithm. Even the ones that have a proc-gen algorithm that the game used for its success, they could have used a different proc-gen algorithm. So there's no magic here, and in many cases, there would be no difference if you generated your procedural content in a completely different way. And now that may seem weird, but here's the thing. This talk that we're having, this is procedurally generated content. This line, this is procedurally generated content. The video that you're watching on YouTube, procedurally generated. Even this OBS window, this software is procedurally generated. There's nothing that's not procedurally generated. So I could say literally anything about procedural generation, and it would just be the same as if I was talking about content. As an easy example, you are generating a world for your game, and you've decided that you need to put some trees in. So what do? You grab a big fat tree brush and goes plunk, 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 and you put in 4,000 trees. That's procedural content, and that's fine. What are your other options? You could do it manually, tree by tree, but that would just be doing the exact same thing but slower. You could create another thing like a shader that renders trees with specific values, and that would be, again, procedural content. There's no way to put these trees into the game without using procedural content generation, so we can just go ahead and call it normal. It's content. There's no magic to it. There's just a matter of whether or not a specific approach is better or worse for what you need. Similarly, you can generate trees using various procedural content engines and get yourself a fun number of trees. Those trees might be better or worse than the trees you'd make by hand, and you might not actually need very many variants because most people don't notice when a tree repeats, but this procedural content generation isn't any more procedurally-ish than if you went into Blender and manually created a tree out of verts. It's just faster. It just uses more of other people's stuff to get the job done. There's nothing wrong with that. You should take advantage of any shortcuts you can that get you what you need, whether that means generating procedural content or just buying content on the asset store and slapping it into your game. It's all valid. Games are very, very hard to make, and you should take these shortcuts, but you shouldn't put a fetish onto it. There is no game where procedural content is what makes the game good because it's procedural content. For example, Minecraft. Everybody says that, well, the world of Minecraft is procedurally generated, and that's why Minecraft is so popular, right? No, Minecraft is popular because you can explore forever, and you can build whatever you want. That requires a procedural world, but it's not popular because of the procedural world. And similarly, you can talk about things like Borderlands, where you've got those procedurally generated guns with all their cool features and stuff. The game requires those guns, but those guns aren't what make the game Borderlands. What makes the game Borderlands is the frenetic gunplay, the loot, the dialogue, the characters, the world. What makes your game is all of the pieces that fit together. And it may be that a procedural piece is the most visible part of that, but it's not going to be what makes your game work. Just ask No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky has some of the most epic procedural content ever created, but of course, it's widely known that it's bland and dull and uninteresting, and that's not true. The only reason it's bland and dull and uninteresting is because all procedural content is bland and dull and uninteresting. Procedural content can't put something in the game that you didn't put there. So what makes the game good is the rest of the game. The visuals, the audioscape, the journeying, the getting along with other players, because now it's multiplayer, so you can build stuff together with them. Those are what make the game fun. But because we're so focused on this one piece, this procedural content piece, many of us don't see the rest of the game and don't give it any shot at all. So I basically want to be excruciatingly clear here. We're currently in a swing where we've become super obsessed with numbers, with generating things, with using numbers to move things around and change the way we're designing our stuff. And that's not going to make your game good. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about procedural content or, optimization or designing to get the right physiological response. All of those things are fine in the right time, at the right place, with the right amount of effort. But making a game is just about making a game. You use whatever tools make it easy for you, but if you have a fetish for using specific approaches, that's going to really limit what sort of games you can make, and you may end up accidentally making a really boring game because only one piece of it had any real effort put into it. Anyway, that's my downer thought on the state of the industry.